Welcome to the Support Raising Podcast, a ministry of VIA. We are excited to bring you the best leaders and practitioners in these three areas: spiritually healthy, vision-driven, and fully funded. We hope their insight will help you move forward in your partnership development. Today, as our special guest, which I am filled with anticipation to hear what great insights he has to share with us and a little bit of the history of the God Ask, is Steve Shadrach, the founder of Via Generosity, formerly Support Raising Solutions, and the founder of VIA, formerly the Center for Mission Mobilization, which is the parent ministry of Via Generosity. Steve has trained thousands of Christian workers from over 1,200 organizations around the world on how to raise their support, as well as authored the God Ask. Steve currently serves as the global ambassador for VIA. He and his wife, Carol, reside in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and they are blessed with 5 grown children and 9 grandchildren. Thanks so much, Steve, for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you on the podcast.
Honored to be here, Mark. Thanks for inviting me.
Man, what a privilege. And whenever I read that, I'm just amazed at the work God has done and how he's multiplied it and how meaningful and useful it's been to so many great commission workers, and what a freedom it's given them. And so kind of what we want to talk a little bit today, we have a series, and the series is the basics of support raising. And the topic we're going to work on today is the perspective of a God asker. And I think it's a really foundational part because perspective is sort of something we get to choose. It's not something that's forced on us, and perspective can really skew the way we look at things and impact the way we act. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how this kind of developed and then what you see it doing. So one of our first questions, Steve, would be, can you talk about, maybe you have an experience or an example that stands out in your mind where you were really keenly aware where someone's perspective impacted their support raising? You got a good anecdote for us there to kind of get us to think about how perspective impacts how we support raise?
Well, gosh, there's so many people. I think it really applies to all of us. We have a shift, I think in my own life, Mark, I'm sure that I viewed it early on as begging. My dad viewed it as begging. I had 2 different role models in college. One had the perspective, I could tell, a healthy perspective on support raising, and the other one really an unhealthy. And they were, it was a real poverty mentality, and they were afraid to ask, and it was a necessary evil. And so until I could have that shift in my own mind and kind of move from the necessary evil to an incredible privilege and opportunity, I was going to be stuck in my own rut. And so I had to kind of go against the grain of family members, a lot of our culture, just the idea of we Americans tend to be self-sufficient, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We don't need anything from anybody. And so when I grew up, we had all of our own stuff. I mean, we had our own lawnmower, we had our own power washer, we dare not ask anything of any neighbor, so to build this self-sufficient fortress, was our kind of our goal. I could tell from my dad. And so I appreciate that, Dad. But, this idea of asking is a biblical concept. It's a good concept. Asking is good. We have not because we ask not. So I think some of those shifts in my own mind, in my own heart, kind of get out of the environment I was raised in, the American culture I was raised in, and somehow if I could have a more biblical perspective that support raising is good, asking is good. It's not a necessary evil. It's not just something that you would do because you're required to. But so if I could view it as a positive opportunity, that was a shift I know in my own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great example. And there are some things that I experience as we train people globally now, and that idea of perception of asking is begging is kind of universal. Now we all have different takes on it, different countries. Um, how did how did that manifest? Like when you came up with that background, self sufficiency. Like when you went to do a couple of your first support raising meetings, what did that look like? What did it feel like? What did it sound like?
I was so focused on the vision. I think that's one thing that our
Mm,
listeners can take away today is instead of focused on the fear, we're afraid to be rejected. I think
mhm,
that's the huge fear, is that somehow we will be rejected. That's why we don't share the gospel. We care more
mhm,
about us being rejected than Jesus being rejected. And so I think that I was so focused on accomplishing the vision that it didn't really matter how people responded to me.
huh,
Yeah, I knew I was going to get some no's. But I think I was so focused on sharing with them the vision and passion of reaching college students for Christ and inviting them to participate. At that stage of my life, I didn't have any fear of failure. Really, I today in my age, I have good days and bad days. But back then, it was full speed ahead because we're going to fulfill the Great Commission. And if you'd like to join in, if you'd like to, come aboard, come on. Um, and so I think that really impacts people. If they sense that you're stepping into that support appointment and there's fear and there's hesitancy and there's, I don't like to be rejected. And gosh, all these little, you know, seemingly insignificant, almost petty little, emotions and fears that are real, but they've covered us over. They've enslaved us almost. If we can break through all that and say, I'm going to focus on the person and purposes of
mm,
Jesus Christ, and I'm going to lay this vision and passion out there for this person, and then invite them, and then let God speak to them, let God do the work in
yeah.
them. But I'm going to lay it all out there and let God do with what He's going to do with it. But that if they sense that you're really controlled by vision and passion,
Mhm.
not insecurities, not fears, not all these other things that tend to rack us sometimes, but it's purely vision and passion. I don't know. I think people are going to want to join your team.
Well, yeah. I mean, Steve, you're absolutely right. I'm taking an organizational fundraising class right now, and one of the things they say is that you have to act like you're a person worthy of investment. Like the ministry you're
Mhm.
doing is so important that somebody sees that value and wants to contribute. And I love the other thing you said. I mean, it made me think about I was so captured by the vision of the ministry we were in. We did some youth ministry for 20 years that it
Mhm.
overrode my fears. I just knew kids needed to hear about the gospel,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I needed people to help me get there. And so it really did help me move through it. So I love that what you said about that. I mean, that's really good stuff there, Steve. So thanks for saying that. Well, so as you kind of went through that process of raising your support, at what point did you find yourself discovering the God ask, or how did that come about when you kind of were able to articulate it, or was it just a thought in your mind that you're daydreaming one day and it popped in? Like what happened? How
Yeah.
did you get to this point where you know were able to articulate like, oh, this is what I've been doing and this is significant?
Yeah, it was a dream one night. Some golden tablets were lowered down into the my bedroom, and no, 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 just kidding, brother. I think I had been trying to live out the God ask without ever thinking about that phrase. I was
Mhm.
trying to pray, just saturate that appointment in prayer, saturate my own heart in prayer, saturate that person in prayer before I ever got there, asking God to work on my behalf, work in their heart. And then even when I asked, yes, it was a direct ask, but I didn't want to put pressure on them. I didn't want them to. I didn't want them to give out of, out of duty. that they are somehow being forced to. I wanted them really to hear from the Lord. So I think I was kind of trying to live out some of those principles of the God
Mhm.
ask before I ever heard that phrase. And so as I was writing this book, The God Ask, maybe 11 or 12 years ago, we had a little contest. I think that we sent out a big email to our whole list and said, well, we got to name this book. Right now it's called Personal Support Raising. I mean, it was kind of a dry, dusty manual, I think, at the time, what it felt like. And so people, and we we're going to give $100 gift card or something to Starbucks or something if you give us the best name. Well, lo and behold, people started sending in these names. And a missionary friend, a longtime missionary friend in Kenya, Tom Stickney, he said, "Why don't you name it The God Ask?" And I thought that's strange. Are you sure? Do you have your words mixed around, Tom, somehow? No, no. And the way he explained it, and I do mention this in the book, he said, "Yeah, when I go into an appointment, I'm afraid, and what do I do with my fear? Well, I say, Lord, I'm going to go in there, and this is not a Tom ask. This is a God ask. I'm going to lay it out before them, but I'm trusting you that you will take what I'm sharing here and lay it on their heart, and that they will look to you, and that this triangle, there's three of us in this appointment here, not just two of us." And he took all the pressure off, he said.
Mm.
And I started thinking about that, Mark, that there are three people in that appointment. It's you, the Christian worker. It's that person you're approaching, the potential donor. But don't leave the most important person of the three out,
Yeah.
because he is leading you, he is guiding you, he's speaking through you. And now on the other side of that triangle, you're hoping and asking and praying that God will lead that person and that they will seek the Lord. And gosh, what a great partnership when God brings two people together like that, that they're both looking to Him for leadership and guidance. And that's what I call a true partnership. And so I remember Googling that. This was, I'm showing my age here, but that's kind of when we first started saying, well, let's Google it. And so the God ask, I put that in quotes, it was nowhere to be found. I'm telling you, I did not see one instance where the God ask was there. And I said, so at first it sounded strange to me. And then it sounded fascinating the more I thought about it. And then it became profound.
Mhm.
And so I don't know why God has used that little triangle illustration all over the world. It's not like it's anything, I think I flunked out of remedial math. It's not like I knew my geometry very well or something, the triangle concept. But it is powerful. It's very powerful. And so God has used it, and I'm thankful for it. But really, I have to give credit to Tom Stickney. He was the one that actually came up with the name. So
That's great job, Tom, wherever you are. If you're listening to
yeah,
this, hey, you hit us up. We'll get you some great via merchandise because you contributed mightily to the kingdom there with that great
definitely,
observation.
definitely.
Steve, I loved it. When we translate the book, they almost every language will come back to us and they'll say, "Yeah, we don't really talk like that." And then they'll say, "Now it's a little curious." And then they'll move to the profound, like, but it sort of has that expanding impact everywhere. And they're as we translate the book, they are writing new language, like they're creating terminology because it doesn't exist in their culture. It's very fascinating to me. Um, but and I know a lot of the principles. I mean, you were like you said, you were living these out because you had studied and you studied scripture particularly thoroughly on some of these things. And so I'd love if you could give us a few minutes, like when you were studying, like you described, you learned some things about God's role from scripture in support raising. Is there anything that you think would be particularly helpful for our listeners as they understand the God ask? Um, you know, what are some key things they should know about God that you kind of just, you learned from some other people, but I know that you kind of gleaned that you could share with us today?
Well, I just got through having lunch with a college student, and we were talking about, when God puts us in difficult situations, desperate situations, that we try to do it in our own strength, our own flesh, and it's just what a joke, that we would think we could pull this off in our own strength, our own flesh. And I told him about a verse that I've gone to, over and over, Mark. It's Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards over the city, the watchmen stay awake in vain. And it says, you can rise up early, you can retire late, you can eat the bread of painful labor, but the Lord gives to his beloved even in their sleep. And so there's this thing about concept of we better look to God to do it on our own. And so there's kind of a little phrase that I would pray along with that verse. Lord, I can't. Lord, I can't. I'm weak. I'm tired. I'm feeling burned out. I'm scared. I'm not seeing the progress. All the things that could create a dark cloud around us, and even cause us to want to give up. The journey of support raising is one of the greatest character builders you'll ever experience in your life. You talk about learning how to persevere in life. If you can persevere through, from scratch all the way to 100% team, boy, you're gonna learn how to persevere in life. But and so I would pray, Lord, I can't. But then you never said I could. Lord, you can. But then you always said you would. Yeah. I know it sounds like a cheesy little poem, but it communicates that we better take this God-ask concept very seriously. And if we try to just make it the Mark ask, the Shad ask, as if I'm gonna see how, tough and rough I can be in these appointments, and I'm just gonna jam it down their throat, and I'm gonna have the best materials and the best ask and the best, Well, yeah, you can try to do it all in your own flesh, all in your own strength, but I think God's gonna, he gives grace to the humble, but he opposes the proud. And I think there've been a few times in my life, Mark, that I've been prideful in my life to the point where I've almost sensed that God is opposing me. Hello. I don't think you're going to get very far if God is opposing you. And so humility and perseverance are so important in support raising. And I think that the character factor, we underestimate the role that character plays in starting and persevering and completing your support raising. The character, it comes out big time in support raising, like nothing I've hardly ever seen.
Yeah. I mean, you got it, Steve. I think, as I heard you talk, I just was thinking about, when we strive for God's role in creation to be our own God, to make our own way, like we get crushed under the weight. Like we were never designed to be in that seat. And that's what happened when we sinned, we put ourselves in that role and it crushes us unto death. Right. And then when we try to do it under our own power, we know ultimately we can't make this happen. And so to put God back in his proper place at the top of that pyramid is really important. And then the second thing you said, I thought that was really significant there, Steve, was we talk about spiritual health as our very first component before vision driven, before fully funded, but God's transformative work in you, the character, who you are. It's really hard to be in your proper role as related to God without that deepening character. And anyway, I just thought that those were really good highlights there. And you talked about this a little earlier. I thought we'd transition here, but how have you seen this model that Tom came up with and suggested? But how have you seen it impact both the fundraiser and the potential partner?
Well, I'm not suggesting that our listeners, our support raisers today that are tuning in would draw out the God ask in each appointment. I'm not suggesting that. There may be an appropriate time and person. You don't want to portray yourself as the teacher and the person you're meeting with is the student, and sit down, let me draw this out and explain these things
Yeah,
to
yeah.
you, No, 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 no. But there may be a time if this is a new concept for them, support raising, that may be an appropriate time to kind of draw that out. But um, I think in the appointment itself, I like to make the ask in the appointment, Mark. I think I'd say about half the people that you meet with have probably pretty much already made a decision by the time they get to that appointment.
Yeah.
Either yes or no, right?
Mhm.
um, but we have not because we ask not, and so I think many times we couch it, saying, "Will you pray about joining my team?" Well, that's really a different question than "Will you join my team?"
Yes, it is, isn't it?
So I think our listeners today, those who are watching or listening, need to decide: do I want to, in that appointment? I worked hard, man. I worked hard to get that appointment. I mean, I called and texted and rescheduled, and finally have 45 minutes at Starbucks. Probably never again will I get this 45 minutes with this person. Well, don't kind of cop out and go, "Oh, I'm sure we'll have other opportunities." No, 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 no. This may be the only 45 minutes you'll ever have with this person. And I'm not saying, be belligerent or try to cram something in that shouldn't be in, but I like to use that time. And of course, a face-to-face ask, we always have trained that is the best. And so I want to couch everything with God-asked language and principles, that I truly want them to go to the Lord and seek the Lord to say, am I in this ministry someone that God would want you to partner with? But I go ahead at the end of our time. Are there any questions at all that you have? And I pull out my levels of giving chart, and I want to get to campus in 43 days, and I still have $2,100 in support left, and here are the levels I'm asking people for. And brother, I don't even know what to ask you for. I've been thinking and praying about, and would you be open to coming on at one of these $150 a month levels, or gosh, maybe even one of these $300 a month levels? I'm wondering, could one of those work for you? And then at some point, I've got to zip the lip and trust God and trust that person, but it is their turn to talk. And so, I think different people make different decisions as to whether they're going to make that ask in the appointment or not. I just don't want fear to control me.
Yeah.
I don't want the reason I'm doing stuff or not doing stuff because of fear. That's not a good motive. That's not a good way to operate.
Yeah. Oh, Steve, it's a solid gem for our listeners, and I really appreciate you leaning into that. And I think, as I really like the God ask for when I start to feel tension in a meeting where I feel like my potential partner is getting nervous or anxious about it. And I love for them. And almost every time this happens, and I don't use it only when things get a little awkward. And I want them to understand, like, they're engaging with the Lord. And if he says no to them, that's great. Like, we don't want to do anything, again, not out of compulsion, but I love the freedom it gives both the support raiser and the partner, to say, okay, I am trusting the Lord, regardless of what direction he gives me, that he's going to provide me as the ministry, and the partner to answer to the passion and the guidance he's given us, and yet he still will provide on either end. He's going to take care. He's going to give me some place to invest as a partner, and he's going to provide for my needs, even if this person doesn't meet it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Steve, as we start to kind of wrap up things here, what is there anything you would suggest, any further study that you might have our listeners do or work on, just as they kind of want to investigate this perspective a little bit more? Anything
Mm-hmm.
come to mind that you would kind of have them work on so that they could kind of learn on their own about this and validate what we're saying?
Well, I think all of us need to have some go-to verses.
Okay.
think about some key verses of scripture that you're going to need. And I just call them go-to verses because
Mhm.
you find yourself in all kinds of situations,
Mhm.
these discussions, these appointments, and what's your go-to verse when you're feeling pressure or you're feeling fear or you're wondering if God's really going to come through and really deliver here, and all the emotions that we experience, all the fears that surround support raising. I've seen grown men who are, CEOs of large companies that have decided to go into ministry. And now they're going to raise their support, and this big, strong, bold executive type all of a sudden just kind of just melts into a little mound of jelly in a support appointment. There's something that just frightens the heebie-jeebies out of us. And so, what's your go-to verse? Sometimes I did a study on all the I wills,
Mm.
all the places in the scriptures that God, and especially Jesus, said, I will. Well, that's a promise. When Jesus said, I will,
Yeah.
those are the kind of go-to verses that you need to. One that I love here that's really in the front of the God ask here, that I put it here for a purpose, Mark, but in some ways it is the God ask. It's Psalm 138, verse 3. And it says, on the day I called, you answered me.
Mm.
You made me bold with strength in my soul. And so, gosh, if there's ever a time that we need some boldness, we need some strength, um, it's, in our personal support raising and those appointments, and not to give up, to keep persevering. So on the day I called, you answered me, and you made me bold with strength in my soul. I don't know, brother. That verse is a go-to verse.
And
It's a go-to verse.
oh, and even just as you read it, it's comforting right now. I mean, like it's just got such a gravity to it. And it illustrates the point of dependence on God, provision from God, our proper role, trusting, and we're created. And yeah, I was thinking, Steve, as you were talking, I did a boot camp in Rwanda with some of our partners there, and we got to this stage where we were working on, is it biblical to ask for support? And um, one of the participants that was Rwandan said to the whole class, I just don't see anywhere in the Bible where it says we should ask. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting, because I'm in somebody else's country, and all of a sudden the other participants started to call out verses. You have not because you ask not. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask. Like, and they just kept going and going. And it was this really marvelous experience of seeing how scripture, like you just demonstrated, demonstrates that we are absolutely permitted to ask of God and also to ask of people who are made in his image. And it is such a privilege, but it changed the room. Like it was like a light bulb turned on for them, that asking is biblical and God tells us to do it. And so, I mean, just as you were sharing those things and you shared that verse from the front of the God ask, I mean, they were emboldened with strength and with that. And 20 of the people from that boot camp have raised their support in
Wow.
Rwanda. I mean, that's pretty cool
Wow.
stuff. And it's, I mean, you captured it, but that's really that's great, Steve. So any last comments? And thanks again for being here. Is there anything you want to say before we sign off today?
Well, I think the topic is really perspective. What is
Mhm.
my perspective towards support raising? And, we spent about half the book really talking about perspective. I gotten some criticism on that, Mark, in the past. Shadrach, why did you waste all this time, 150 pages or something, on perspective? Why didn't you just get right to the goodies, the techniques, how do you make the call and how do you make the ask and all these, the mechanics of it. Oh, and I said, oh, my friend, let me back up a little bit here. My dad used to say, where there's a will, there's a way. I have to work on my mind, my heart. I have to get the right perspective first before if if you just jump right in without the right perspective, you're going to hit a roadblock big time. So, that's why I think reading that first section of the book, not skipping through it, really letting it soak in, letting the Holy Spirit bring conviction in areas. Am I vision driven or am I budget driven? That seems to be a big area,
Mhm.
that the Holy Spirit seems to convict people. But also, if I enter into my support raising, I get criticized for this sometimes because it sounds prideful. But if I enter into my support raising as to if I raise my support, I don't think you're going to get to full support.
Yeah.
No, I mean, unless you enter in with a full faith, never give up, never look back, failure's not an option, not if I raise my support, but simply when I raise my support. That doesn't have to be a, you know, a human flesh, human strength kind of an
Mhm.
attitude. It can be, God, I'm going to hold on to you and I'm not going to let go until we are at 100%, you know. And so I think that kind of perspective, not if, no, no, please, no. That's almost like going into marriage. Yeah. If we get along every day, if we, then we'll stay married. No, I'm afraid no, that's not the case. You got to commit on the
Yeah.
front end that this is going to be
Mhm.
full blown ahead, no turning back. We close all exit ramps, full speed ahead. And I just think it's not psychological mumbo gumbo. You're trying to get yourself psyched up in front of a mirror. That's not it. But just, am I going to trust God and hang on
Mhm.
and persevere through this whole process? There's no greater preparation for ministry. There's no greater prerequisite for ministry
Hmm.
than going through the whole process of raising your support. And if you can do it with the right perspective, then it overflows. It overflows into your ministry.
Yeah.
That not if perspective, but when. It overflows into your marriage. It overflows into every area of life, really. So perspective is huge. It's the key. If you have the right perspective, you'll be successful in your support raising. If you don't, oh, you're gonna have some real heartache, I think.
Yeah. You're so right. And thank you, Steve, for that final word. And I was thinking, if you really work at seeing things the way God sees them, it really helps you, doesn't it? Because otherwise you're seeing it the way we do, and that's just not possible. And so we have to see it with God's perspective. So that's a great final thought for us today. Thanks again, Steve, for joining us, and
Of
yeah,
course,
for
I'm
your
honored.
investment in so many of us through your books and your work. Um, we're just really blessed to have been a part of the outworkings of what you've done and what you've learned from some of our fellow stalwarts in Ellis and
Oh yeah,
Scott and some of those guys. So
oh yeah,
thanks for sharing what
oh
you
yeah.
do.
Of course, thank you, brother.